After the fighting ceased, in the quiet months following the Grand Allied victory, teams of intelligence officers embarked on a meticulous task. They interrogated countless German generals and senior staff, probing their experiences and perceptions. These extensive interviews, now preserved within the National Archives Foreign Military Studies, began to reveal a consistent and unexpected thread. When pressed on which Allied contingents presented the most formidable challenge, the German High Command offered responses that diverged significantly from initial Allied assumptions. British forces earned acknowledgement for their methodical and professional conduct. The Soviets, they conceded, were relentlessly aggressive, capable of sustaining truly staggering losses. Yet when the conversation turned to the Americans, a different vocabulary emerged. Unpredictable, aggressively determined, and often simply terrifying. Even the formidable Field Marshal, whose memoirs were published posthumously, recorded an observation about these American formations that initially surprised many who read it. Following their initial devastating encounter with American troops in the Kasserine Pass region during February of 1943, he noted a particular quality. Despite the significant initial setbacks endured by the American defense, their tactical response had been, in his own words, first class. He further elaborated that the American units exhibited a remarkably swift recovery from the first shock, soon managing to halt the German advance by consolidating their remaining reserves to secure critical mountain passes and other strategic points. This was not the polite commendation of a victor to a vanquished foe. It was the discerning assessment of a seasoned professional soldier encountering something both unexpected and intrinsically dangerous. The Americans had been severely beaten, yet they had not shattered. Their adaptation had begun even as the battle continued to rage around them. The architect of the Ardennes offensive, a commander of immense experience, was captured toward the war's end. When Allied interrogators questioned him about which American general had made the deepest impression, he reportedly named a specific armored commander as their most effective. Such an assessment would have been considered utterly preposterous just 2 years prior. Indeed, when American forces first engaged the German military in direct combat, the immediate outcomes were nothing short of catastrophic. The subsequent transformation of these American units remains one of the most remarkable instances of military evolution in contemporary history. It explains how hardened German soldiers, accustomed to years of fighting the British, came to view comparatively inexperienced Americans as their most perilous adversaries. To comprehend why these German professionals who had engaged British forces since 1940 eventually held a greater apprehension of American fighting capabilities, one must first examine what should have been a terminal blow to American military standing. In February 1943, untested American divisions found themselves thrust into their first major engagement against battle-hardened German formations, deep within a remote mountain pass in Tunisia, known as Kasserine. The circumstances leading to this encounter were largely self-inflicted. The commanding general of the American II Corps had established his elaborate headquarters approximately 70 miles behind the active front. Engineers spent 3 weeks constructing this subterranean complex, while the general's forward elements occupied exposed positions, stretched thin across a wide sector, notably devoid of any coherent defensive strategy. The Supreme Allied Commander for the European theater later recorded in his memoirs that this instance marked the only time during the entire conflict where he witnessed a divisional or higher command so preoccupied with its own security that it opted for deeply entrenched underground shelters. This particular general rarely visited his frontline units, and his communications were couched in a bewildering private dialect that left his subordinates constantly guessing at his true intentions. Consequently, his forces were widely dispersed and fundamentally unprepared for what was coming. Just days before the German assault, one infantry regiment alone received 450 new replacements, many of whom had never completed basic training. A portion of these men arrived at their units without the most fundamental piece of equipment, their rifles. The primary American infantry anti-tank weapon, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher, only reached the front lines on February 12th, a mere 2 days before the German attack commenced. On February 14, 1943, two formidable German panzer divisions launched their assault at Sidi Bouzid. The result was an immediate and complete collapse. American tanks, attempting to launch hasty counterattacks, were systematically destroyed in isolated engagements by German units, exhibiting vastly superior coordination and overwhelming firepower. American infantry positions disintegrated under the combined onslaught of armored thrusts and devastating close air support. By the evening of February 16th, the two corps had suffered significant losses. Approximately 1,600 men, nearly 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces were gone. Communication networks failed. Units began to withdraw without receiving orders. Panic began to ripple through the rear area headquarters. Over the subsequent week, American forces recoiled almost 50 miles amidst increasing confusion and disorder. The German armored columns pushed through the Kasserine Pass itself on February 20th, threatening to cleave the entire Allied front and seize vital supply depots. Total American casualties eventually climbed to approximately 6,300 men, in stark contrast to fewer than 1,000 German losses. It was a humiliating defeat, seemingly validating every German preconception about American military incompetence. German soldiers who participated in the Kasserine engagement remembered the experience with open disdain. American officers appeared utterly incapable of coordinating their disparate forces. Artillery support was described as haphazard, its fire poorly directed. Infantry units, they observed, frequently broke and fled at the mere sight of German armor. It seemed unequivocally clear that these amateur soldiers from across the Atlantic posed no serious threat to the seasoned Wehrmacht. Yet, amidst the chaos of those final days at Kasserine, something unexpected began to emerge. As German forces pressed through the pass, driving toward critical American supply hubs near Thala and Tebessa, they encountered a progressively stiffening resistance that had been entirely absent just days before. American artillery, initially uncoordinated, began to find its mark with increasing regularity. Reserves, previously scattered ineffectively across the extended front, started to converge at critical defensive choke points. The German advance, which had seemed unstoppable, first slowed, then ground to a halt, and then, inexorably, began to recede. The German commander had anticipated exploiting a complete breakthrough. His operational plan had called for a deep drive through the western dorsal mountain range, posing a direct threat to the entire Allied position in Tunisia. Instead, he found himself confronting an adversary that was learning to fight even while still losing the battle. The Americans had been badly beaten, but they had not broken. Their process of adaptation had begun even as shellfire continued to cascade around them. The subsequent developments profoundly unsettled German commanders, who believed they had accurately assessed their new opponent. Within days of the Kasserine disaster, the Supreme Allied Commander initiated a brutal and unsparing review of the catastrophic events. He quickly identified profound failures in leadership, training, inter-service coordination, and fundamental doctrine. Crucially, he acted decisively on these findings. The general responsible for the two corps' performance was quietly relieved of his command and dispatched back to the United States, where he spent the remainder of the conflict training troops on home soil. The Army did not merely single out individuals for blame. It systematically examined its own internal structures and procedures, finding them severely deficient. On March 6, 1943, a new general, known for his aggressive demeanor, arrived to assume command of the two corps, replacing the discredited predecessor. The change was instantaneous, dramatic, and utterly uncompromising. This new commander found a force in utter disarray. Officers routinely kept significant distances from the front lines, avoiding any direct exposure to danger. Discipline was lax, with soldiers frequently disregarding uniform regulations and basic military courtesies. Units operated as fragmented components rather than cohesive, coordinated combined arms formations. Communication between infantry, armor, and artillery was at best intermittent. The new Corps commander issued directives that reportedly unnerved his own staff almost as much as they worried the Germans. He demanded that all officers move to the very front lines, where they could directly observe the combat and personally lead their men. When one general officer remarked with a degree of satisfaction that his armored division had been fortunate enough not to lose any officers on a particular day, the new commander's temper flared. According to accounts preserved in military history journals, he retorted that such an outcome was not fortunate, that was bad for the morale of the enlisted men. He made it unequivocally clear that he expected officers to share the same risks as their troops. He fundamentally reorganized units to function as combined arms teams, where infantry, armor, and artillery operated in seamless coordination. He established unambiguous chains of command and enforced a rigorous, often brutal, discipline. He further insisted that every operation be supported by the maximum available air power. This transformation was neither subtle nor gradual. It represented a complete overhaul of how the two corps operated, achieved within a matter of weeks through sheer force of will. On March 23, 1943, barely 6 weeks after the humiliation at Kasserine, the same German Panzer Division that had inflicted such damage launched another attack near El Getter, a small town in central Tunisia. The German division commander assembled approximately 6,000 men, supported by 50 operational tanks, a company of tank destroyers, and an assault gun battery. They confidently anticipated another effortless victory against these same amateur Americans. At 6 o'clock that morning, 50 German tanks emerged from a mountain pass, fanning out into the El Getter Valley. They advanced in a tightly coordinated formation, with tanks and armored vehicles forming a three-sided protective screen, supported by motorized infantry and half-tracks and motorcycle sidecars. Their artillery remained at the initial start line, firing over the heads of the advancing armor. The formation swept forward rapidly, quickly overrunning American frontline infantry and artillery positions that lay in its path. 2 German tanks penetrated so deeply that they approached within range of the American 1st Infantry Division's headquarters, prompting staff officers to urgently advise their commanding general to relocate to a safer position. This general, however, refused to move. According to accounts documented in unit histories and cited by military historians, his response became legendary among American troops. He declared he would like hell pull out, and he would shoot the first bastard who did. The German attack had covered about half the distance to El Getter when its momentum abruptly crashed into a newly laid American minefield. 8 tanks were immediately disabled, their tracks severed or hulls ruptured by the concealed explosives. The Panzer formation's carefully orchestrated advance faltered as crews attempted to navigate around this sudden obstacle. American artillery forward observers, equipped with portable radios, swiftly called in concentrated fire from multiple batteries. Tank destroyers from an attached battalion, positioned in cleverly concealed locations, opened a devastating fire on the now stalled German armor. By 9:30 that morning, the Germans had already lost 30 tanks and were in full retreat back toward the commanders, whose professional reputations were built on clever maneuver and tactical finesse, found the American way of war almost offensive in its bluntness. But it was undeniably effective. American forces relentlessly advanced across France, absorbed the shock of the Bulge counteroffensive, breached the Rhine River, and drove deep into the very heart of Germany, employing brute force backed by unparalleled industrial might and a uniquely efficient institutional learning system. The German soldiers' ultimate fear of American forces was not, in the end, about individual combat skills or small unit tactics. By most objective measures, German infantry training produced soldiers who were technically superior in fieldcraft, marksmanship, and small unit coordination. German officers often possessed greater experience and displayed more creative tactical thinking. German equipment was frequently more technologically advanced. Yet, none of that mattered when American artillery could blanket an entire area with hundreds of shells arriving simultaneously, with no prior warning. None of that mattered when any German movement by day immediately drew fighter bombers screaming down from the sky within minutes. None of that mattered when every German tactical success was met by American reinforcement and counterattack within hours, long before exhausted German troops could consolidate their gains. The German commanders learned, with each passing week, that a man in New Jersey could invent a metal contraption for a tank, and within days, it would be smashing through every obstacle they faced. Mountain Pass, the attack, intended to effortlessly sweep away the Americans, had been decisively halted within 3.5 hours. Later that afternoon, American signals intelligence intercepted German radio traffic, revealing their plans for a second assault scheduled for later in the day. This time, the Americans were not just waiting, they were fully prepared. When German infantry advanced in the late afternoon, supported by their remaining armor firing from the rear, American artillery unleashed devastating techniques that had been rigorously practiced at training ranges back home. Artillery gunners employed airburst shells designed to explode above the advancing infantry, showering them with lethal shrapnel. They masked fires from multiple batteries, using a technique where all shells were precisely timed to arrive simultaneously, preventing enemy soldiers from finding cover. For the first time in the entire conflict, American forces had not only successfully repelled a full-scale assault by a German panzer division, but had then launched effective counterattacks of their own. The transition from Kasserine's disaster to El Getter's unexpected triumph had transpired in less than 2 months. German commanders observed this remarkably swift recovery with a profound sense of unease. The Americans, they realized, were not merely learning from their errors through isolated individual initiative. They were systematically codifying their lessons and disseminating successful techniques across their entire army at a pace unlike any military organization the Germans had ever encountered. The United States Army had forged a capability that no other fighting force in the world possessed with such systematic rigor. They termed it the Fire Direction Center, a system initially developed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, during the late 1920s and early 1930s by pioneering officers. This method enabled artillery batteries to concentrate fires on targets with unprecedented speed and coordination, all managed through centralized computation of firing solutions. The brilliance of the American artillery system lay in its inherent flexibility and rapid responsiveness. A forward observer, equipped with a portable radio, could request battalion-level fire within approximately 3 minutes of identifying target. The observer was not required to calculate range and direction himself. He simply reported the target's location, and the Fire Direction Center would instantly compute precise firing solutions for every available gun. If a target demanded more destructive power than a single battalion could deliver, the request could be escalated through division and corps artillery headquarters, potentially bringing hundreds of guns to bear on a single point within a matter of minutes. However, the technique that truly instilled dread in German soldiers was called time on target. American artillery commanders meticulously calculated their firing solutions so that shells from multiple batteries, positioned at varying distances and firing angles, would all impact the same point within 3 seconds of each other. There was no audible warning. German soldiers could not hear the approach of individual shells and seek cover before impact because the entire barrage arrived simultaneously. One moment, the front line would be quiet. The next, hundreds of high-explosive detonations would erupt across German positions in a single, deafening concussion. The sheer statistical magnitude behind this artillery system was almost unfathomable to German commanders, who were constantly grappling with critical ammunition shortages. A single American infantry division deployed 48 artillery tubes, including 36 105mm howitzers and 12 heavier 155mm howitzers. These larger caliber guns provided American divisions with significantly greater destructive power per round than comparable German formations. During critical engagements, Americans could unleash a concentrated firepower that utterly dwarfed anything the Germans could possibly muster. During the tenacious defense of Elsenborn Ridge in the December 1944 Battle of the Bulge, More than 300 heavy artillery pieces were arrayed behind American infantry lines. On December 22nd alone, these guns expended over 10,000 rounds. When the American Ninth Army crossed the Rhine River in March 1945, 2,700 American guns delivered approximately 1,000 rounds per minute during the preliminary bombardment, firing a staggering total of over 65,000 rounds. The German field marshal had acknowledged this immense disparity directly in his reports from the front, noting the Americans' great superiority in artillery and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. In a later assessment, he concluded that the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery and even more in the air had broken the front open and made sustained defense impossible. But artillery represented only one facet of what made American forces so profoundly dangerous to German soldiers. The Germans coined a specific term for their most acute fear on the Western Front, Tod, meaning death by fighter bomber. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive American fighter aircraft, became the primary instrument of this aerial terror. These aircraft flew over 545,000 combat sorties throughout the war, delivering more than 132,000 tons of bombs onto German targets, all while maintaining a remarkably low loss rate of just 0.7% per mission. From the Normandy landings until Germany's final capitulation, Thunderbolt pilots claimed the destruction of tens of thousands of railroad cars, locomotives, armored vehicles, and trucks, even allowing for the inevitable exaggerations in pilot combat claims. The sheer scale of destruction inflicted upon German ground forces and their logistical networks was absolutely staggering. The disparity in air superiority over Normandy reached ratios that seemed mathematically impossible. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, the Allies conducted over 14,600 individual sorties. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, could field fewer than 320 serviceable fighters across all of France and could mount only a fraction of that number in actual missions. German pilots faced overwhelming odds each time they took to the sky. The immense production gap between American and German factories eliminated any remote hope of recovery. The United States alone manufactured approximately 96,000 aircraft in 1944. Germany's peak annual production reached roughly 39,800. Total American wartime aircraft production exceeded 295,000 machines, while Germany produced approximately 116,000. The human cost to the Luftwaffe's pilot corps was equally devastating and unsustainable. Between January and May of 1944, over 2,200 German fighter pilots perished in combat. In May of that year alone, a quarter of Germany's entire fighter pilot force was killed. Monthly fighter losses consistently ran between 43 and 56% of available aircraft strength. Veteran pilots, who had survived years of intense combat, were being killed faster than new recruits could be trained to replace them. German ground forces quickly learned to dread clear skies, a visceral fear that dictated every tactical decision. Any daylight movement on roads inevitably drew immediate aerial attack from prowling fighter bombers. Truck convoys were forced to move exclusively under the cover of night. Armored formations often required hours to traverse distances they could have covered in minutes, were it not for the constant threat from above. The omnipresent awareness that American aircraft could appear at any moment paralyzed German logistics, mandated exhausting night movements, caused massive fuel consumption through constant detours, and effectively prevented the timely reinforcement of threatened frontline positions. Yet, despite their overwhelming firepower advantages in both artillery and air power, American forces still encountered problems that technology alone could not immediately resolve. In June and July of 1944, American troops found themselves entangled in the Normandy bocage. This ancient French landscape of dense hedgerows presented obstacles that military planners had not adequately anticipated. The bocage consisted of small fields surrounded by earthen mounds ranging from 4 to 15 feet in height, covered with centuries-old root systems that had grown into virtually impenetrable walls of vegetation. Each field was, in essence, a natural fortress. Tanks could not simply climb these embankments without exposing their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank weapons strategically positioned on the other side. The few existing gaps in the hedgerows were meticulously guarded by German machine guns and anti-tank rockets. A mere handful of German soldiers, equipped with automatic weapons, possessed the capability to halt entire American battalions attempting to advance from one field to the next. The combat within the bocage was nightmarish. American infantry were compelled to clear each field individually through costly frontal assaults. Tank support proved nearly useless, as armor could not effectively move through the dense hedgerows. Artillery was often ineffective, unable to observe targets concealed within the enclosed fields. Between certain villages, American forces sustained approximately 1,000 casualties for every kilometer of advance. At this rate of progress, it was clear it would take years to break out of Normandy. What unfolded next vividly illustrated precisely why German soldiers came to perceive Americans as uniquely dangerous, despite their comparative lack of European military tradition. Across the American sector, individual units began independently formulating solutions to the hedgerow dilemma. Engineers experimented with various explosives. Tank crews devised different methods for breaching the earthen walls. The most renowned solution emerged from an improbable source, one that perfectly encapsulated the distinct qualities that differentiated the American military from its European counterparts. A sergeant serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, attached to the V Corps under the 1st Army, was involved. He hailed from Cranford, New Jersey, where he had worked before the conflict. According to historian Max Hastings in his work on the Normandy campaign, the initial conceptual spar for a hedgerow breaching device originated with an ordinary private from Tennessee, who, during a discussion about the problem, suggested attaching saw-like teeth to the front of tanks, enabling them to cut through the hedgerows as a saw cuts wood. While many other soldiers scoffed at this seemingly naive idea, the sergeant recognized its fundamental soundness and began the arduous work of developing a practical implementation. This sergeant later made efforts to credit the private with the original concept, but this crucial detail was largely overlooked amidst the publicity surrounding the eventual invention. The device the sergeant created was elegantly simple in its underlying concept, but brilliantly executed. 4 robust steel prongs were welded to the front hull of a Sherman tank, fashioned from scrap steel salvaged from the formidable German beach obstacles, known as Czech hedgehogs, that had been scattered across the Normandy beaches. When a tank equipped with these prongs drove into a hedgerow, the teeth would bore into the earthen wall, pinning the tank's belly to the ground and preventing it from riding up over the obstacle. The Sherman could then smash directly through the hedgerow under a protective canopy of dirt and roots, emerging on the other side with its guns immediately ready to engage the enemy. On July 14, 1944, a Corps commander observed a demonstration of this novel device. In his memoirs, he described watching in awe as a hedgerow exploded to make way for the Sherman tank bursting through the other side. He immediately ordered the mass production of these hedgerow cutters. Work proceeded around the clock under camouflage netting to maintain secrecy from German aerial reconnaissance. By the launch of Operation Cobra on July 25th, a mere 11 days after the demonstration, 3 out of every 5 tanks in the 1st Army were equipped with what became known variously as the Kulin hedgerow cutter, the Rhino device, or simply the Kulin cutter. Over 500 of these devices were manufactured within that remarkably brief time frame. The Supreme Allied Commander later recollected that the biggest and happiest group in all the Allied armies that night were those who knew this device worked. The sergeant received the Legion of Merit for his invention, which proved instrumental in breaking the Normandy stalemate. Several months later, he stepped on an anti-personnel mine in the Hürtgen forest near the German border and lost his left foot. His ingenious invention, however, remained in continuous use until the war's end. The narrative of this sergeant perfectly illustrated why German professional soldiers found Americans so dangerous, despite their initial lack of experience. In the German army, a sergeant would never have been encouraged to develop tactical innovations on his own initiative. Such matters were strictly reserved for officers and military engineers. In the more rigid British Army, such a suggestion would have been meticulously routed through proper channels and subjected to evaluation by committees. Yet, in the American Army, a sergeant from New Jersey could adopt an idea from a Tennessee private, construct a functional prototype in a makeshift field repair shop, demonstrate it to a commanding general, and witness its deployment across an entire army in less than 2 weeks. Operation Cobra itself, launched shortly thereafter, provided a stark demonstration of what American forces could achieve when their full destructive capacity was brought to bear on a concentrated objective. On July 25th, approximately 1,800 heavy bombers were dispatched, with roughly 1,500 effectively dropping more than 3,000 tons of bombs on a target area 4 miles long and less than 2 miles deep, situated west of the town of St. Lo. Additional strikes from medium bombers and fighter bombers added almost another 1,000 tons to this concentrated devastation. The Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of Germany's best-equipped armored formations, bore the brunt of this overwhelming aerial assault. The bombing inflicted an estimated 1,000 German fatalities and completely obliterated command posts, tanks, artillery pieces, and vital communications equipment. Entire units simply ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. A tragic friendly fire incident during Operation Cobra also resulted in the deaths of 111 American soldiers and nearly 500 wounded. Among the dead was the commanding general of Army Ground Forces, who was observing the attack from a forward position, making him the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. But the tactical success of the operation was undeniable. By July 27th, the German 7th Army reported 7 distinct ruptures in its defensive line that were beyond repair. Over 100,000 American combat troops poured through a gap, less than 5 miles wide, in what rapidly became an unstoppable torrent. By August 1st, a new American army was officially activated, and the breakout from Normandy was complete. The bocage, which had exacted such a heavy toll on American lives, became strategically irrelevant within days as armored columns raced across the open French countryside. This recurring pattern of encountering a severe setback, followed by rapid adaptation, and then overwhelming success, manifested throughout the American experience in the Second World War. Nowhere, however, was this more dramatic or consequential than in December of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge ultimately became the largest engagement ever fought by the United States Army, with over 600,000 American soldiers eventually committed across the frozen forests and villages of Belgium and Luxembourg, facing more than 200,000 German troops, who launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes on December 16th. The American response at critical defensive points shattered the German timetable and transformed a potential catastrophe into what a certain British Prime Minister would later call undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the entire war and an ever-famous American victory. At Elsenborn Ridge, forming the northern shoulder of the German penetration, an untested infantry division and a veteran one held their ground against Hitler's elite armored units. The 6th Panzer Army, spearheading the main attack, included Waffen-SS divisions personally chosen by the German leader for what was meant to be a decisive breakthrough that would split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. A young lieutenant commanded an 18-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, reinforced by 4 artillery forward observers, who joined their position. When German forces attacked on December 16th, this small unit of 22 men found itself confronting an entire German parachute battalion, roughly 500 soldiers from a 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. The lieutenant's men steadfastly held their positions through hours of continuous, intense fighting, inflicting approximately 92 casualties on the attacking Germans and critically delaying the advance of an armored spearhead of the offensive. This small unit would later be recognized as the most decorated American unit of its size in the entire Second World War. Behind the infantry positions at Elsenborn Ridge, more than 300 artillery pieces concentrated their fires into an impenetrable wall of exploding steel, rendering the ridge approaches virtually impassable for attacking German forces. The German general commanding the 5th Panzer Army on the southern attack route later conceded that the German counteroffensive ultimately failed because their right flank, near Monschau, ran headlong against a wall it could not break. At the crucial road junction of St. Vith, a determined armored division, under its brigadier general, held out for nearly a week against overwhelming German forces, throwing the German offensive timetable into considerable disarray. The Supreme Allied commander later characterized the defense of St. Vith as a turning point of the entire battle. But the most enduring American stand of the Bulge occurred at Bastogne, a modest Belgian crossroads town that controlled access to the main road network through the Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne effectively controlled all movement through the entire region. The 101st Airborne Division was hastily dispatched to Bastogne from camps in France, and elements of the 10th Armored Division soon found themselves completely encircled and outnumbered approximately 4-1 by German forces. The American defenders lacked adequate winter clothing, were running perilously short of ammunition, and possessed no means to evacuate their wounded. On December 22nd, German officers, under a flag of truce, approached American lines southeast of Bastogne. They carried a written ultimatum from the German Corps commander. "The fortune of war is changing," it declared, asserting that battalions are ready to annihilate the American troops in and near Bastogne. The message demanded surrender within 2 hours or face total destruction, warning that all civilian casualties resulting from the ensuing artillery bombardment would be the responsibility of the American commander. The German delegation was subsequently blindfolded and led to an American command post, where the message was delivered to the acting division commander, as a superior was attending a conference in Washington. According to multiple witnesses present in the command post, the acting commander read the German ultimatum, crumpled the paper into a ball, tossed it into a wastebasket, and uttered a single dismissive word. When his staff attempted to draft a formal diplomatic reply to the surrender demand, a lieutenant colonel suggested that the general's initial reaction perfectly encapsulated the American position. The official reply, typed on a single sheet of paper and delivered to the waiting German officers by the colonel who escorted them, contained exactly one word, in capital letters: nuts. When the bewildered German delegation inquired whether this constituted a favorable or unfavorable response, the colonel clarified the American position in plain language. He informed them that if they did not comprehend what nuts meant in plain English, it was equivalent to telling them to go to hell. The 101st tenaciously held Bastogne against repeated armored and infantry attacks over the ensuing days. On December 26th, after a siege lasting more than a week, elements of an American field army broke through German lines from the south to relieve the surrounded garrison. This relief of Bastogne represented one of the most remarkable operational maneuvers of the entire Second World War. The American army had been engaged in attacking eastward into the German Saar industrial region when the Ardennes offensive began. At a conference held on December 19th, the general commanding the American army promised his superior he could disengage 3 divisions from combat, pivot them 90 degrees to the north, and launch an attack within 48 hours. On December 26th, an armored division reached Bastogne, with a particular tank nicknamed Cobra King, making the first contact with the beleaguered defenders. Military historians have meticulously studied this maneuver for decades, attempting to understand how any army could accomplish such a feat in such a limited time frame. The explanation lay in the general's characteristic foresight and preparation for all contingencies. Anticipating that some unforeseen event might disrupt the Allied front somewhere, he had already developed comprehensive contingency plans for reorienting his forces northward. When the critical order arrived, his staff simply executed plans that were already in an advanced state of preparation. By mid-January of 1945, the German salient had been eliminated, and American forces were pressing back toward the German frontier. The human cost of the battle was staggering on both sides. Approximately 19,200 Americans lost their lives, and total American casualties reached roughly 80,000. German losses were equally devastating, with an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 total casualties, plus hundreds of tanks and assault guns that the collapsing German war economy could never replace. Why were the Americans consistently able to recover from surprise and defeat with such speed, while German forces, despite their initial tactical successes, could not sustain their momentum? The answer lay in fundamentally divergent organizational philosophies that shaped how each army learned, adapted, and improved. The United States Army had constructed a systematic feedback loop that, in terms of speed and comprehensiveness, no other military organization in history had ever matched. The Army Ground Forces published a series of training bulletins, including combat lessons, rank and file in combat, and battle experiences, which rapidly disseminated frontline innovations across all theaters of operation. Observer teams routinely inspected combat units and submitted reports on what proved effective and what failed. This critical information flowed back to training commands in the United States, where training programs were continuously adjusted based on actual combat experience. The rapidity of this adaptation was extraordinary. Replacement training cycles were repeatedly modified based on battlefield reports. Training, which had been 13 weeks before Pearl Harbor, was compressed to 8 weeks immediately after the attack to meet urgent manpower demands, then expanded to 17 weeks by August of 1943 when combat experience demonstrated that rush training led to excessive casualties, and then adjusted again to 15 weeks during the Bulge crisis when replacements were desperately needed. Each adjustment reflected concrete lessons learned from actual combat, not theoretical doctrine developed in peacetime classrooms. The contrast with German training methods was stark. While American programs evolved continuously based on direct frontline feedback, German replacement training steadily deteriorated as the war progressed. By 1944, German replacements frequently arrived at the front with only a few weeks of instruction, sometimes without ever having fired their assigned weapons. The institutional learning that progressively enhanced American forces was simply absent within the disintegrating German military system. Where Americans deployed observer teams to the front and circulated lessons learned bulletins within weeks, German units often hoarded successful tactics locally and penalized officers who admitted failures, rather than studying them for improvement. When the sergeant invented his hedgerow cutter in Normandy, the concept was evaluated, approved, mass-produced, and deployed across an entire army in under 2 weeks. When American infantry proved vulnerable to German tank attacks in Tunisia, new anti-tank tactics were swiftly developed, tested, and distributed to units worldwide within a few months. The American system was fundamentally designed to learn from failure, rather than to punish or conceal it. The British Army, meanwhile, approached warfare with a fundamentally different doctrine. Their most influential commander of the war had been profoundly affected by the horrific casualties of the First World War and the early British military disasters in North Africa. His doctrine emphasized meticulously planned, set-piece battles executed with overwhelming force, coupled with tight central control of operations. British attacks were carefully coordinated and thoroughly supported, which made them effective and minimized casualties. However, this approach also rendered them slow and predictable. Consequently, German defenders usually knew precisely what to expect. German officers who had fought the British for years understood their methods and could reliably anticipate their movements. The British were dangerous, certainly, but their danger manifested in familiar and manageable ways. A German commander facing this British general could predict with reasonable accuracy when and where the British would attack and how they would conduct their operations. The Americans, in contrast, offered no such predictability. The German army, paradoxically, was systematically dismantling its own greatest competitive advantage. The Wehrmacht had forged its tactical excellence on a concept known as Auftragstaktik, typically translated as mission-type tactics. This doctrine granted subordinate commanders extraordinary freedom to improvise and adapt their methods, provided they achieve their assigned objectives. A German battalion commander confronting an unexpected situation did not need to request permission from higher headquarters before adjusting his approach. He was expected to exercise his judgment and initiative. This inherent flexibility had made German forces the most tactically effective army in the world during the early years of the conflict. German units routinely outmaneuvered and outfought larger Allied formations through superior initiative and rapid adaptation at the small unit level. However, the German leaders' increasing interference in military operations systematically stifled this crucial flexibility. His halt order in December 1941, forbidding any retreats during the Soviet winter counteroffensive, marked the inception of a pattern that would progressively erode German military effectiveness. By 1943 and 1944, blanket no retreat orders eliminated all initiative at every level of command. Talented commanders who argued for tactical withdrawals were summarily dismissed or faced even worse consequences. Ideological loyalty to the regime increasingly supplanted military competence as the primary route to advancement. German units, which possessed the inherent capacity to adapt to changing situations, found themselves frozen in place by rigid directives issued from a distant headquarters, led by a man who had not personally visited the front lines in years. The immense production disparity underlying American advantages was almost unfathomable to German soldiers and commanders confronting American forces. The United States alone produced approximately 295,000 aircraft over the entire war. American factories constructed roughly 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. They manufactured over 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition and approximately 1 billion artillery rounds. They turned out more than 2 million military trucks, which were essential for supplying Allied forces across 3 continents. The scale of American logistical support was equally staggering. The famous Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that sustained Allied forces after the Normandy breakout, operated with approximately 6,000 trucks at its peak, delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies daily to advancing combat units. African-American soldiers, comprising roughly 3/4 of the Red Ball drivers, maintained this critical supply line around the clock despite exhaustion, intermittent enemy air attacks, and roads churned to mud by constant, heavy traffic. American doctrine explicitly embraced a trade-off, material for lives. Combat analysts calculated that American forces expended substantially more ammunition per engagement than any other army in the war. This seemingly lavish use of firepower was not wasteful extravagance. It was a deliberate strategy that yielded measurably lower casualty rates than armies that conserved ammunition but sacrificed lives. The American military had consciously decided that industrial output was more readily replaceable than trained soldiers. When an American infantry platoon came under fire, the instinct deeply ingrained in every soldier was not to close with the enemy through intricate maneuver, but to call in overwhelming supporting fires and allow artillery and aircraft to do the killing. When supplies ran short, Americans simply manufactured more. When equipment was destroyed, replacements arrived within days. When tactics failed, new approaches were developed, rigorously tested, and deployed in a matter of weeks. The German military-industrial complex, crippled by Allied bombing and starved of raw materials by naval blockade, could not even begin to approach this level of output. This reality formed the basis of the German fear of Americans, despite their initial dismissal of them as amateur soldiers who would inevitably crumble under the pressure of European military professionals. The British posed a threat akin to a skilled fencer. One could study their techniques and develop effective countermeasures. The Soviets presented a danger similar to an overwhelming flood. They arrived in immense numbers, absorbing casualties until something eventually gave way. But the Americans combined elements of both these threats, while adding something uniquely their own. They assimilated lessons faster than any enemy anticipated. They adapted their tactics, even in the midst of ongoing battles. They produced and deployed new equipment at speeds that often seemed physically impossible. They wielded firepower as a substitute for tactical finesse, burying problems under literal avalanches of shells and bombs rather than attempting to outmaneuver opponents. And most disturbing of all from the German perspective, they never seemed to exhaust their essential resources. When American forces came under fire, they did not simply return fire and seek out better defensive positions, as professional soldiers were traditionally taught. They returned fire, immediately summoned devastating artillery and air strikes on the source of the enemy fire. And then, as soon as the supporting fires lifted, they advanced toward the enemy position. They did not endeavor to outwit their opponents or outmaneuver them through clever tactics. Their strategy was to overwhelm them with superior firepower and relentless aggression. Crucially, they possessed the industrial capacity to make this approach work consistently. This method was not elegant. It was not subtle. It did not demonstrate the operational artistry that German staff officers had spent their careers meticulously perfecting. German